The freedom to practice religion is a fundamental right of all Americans. It is so important to the framers of the Constitution they included it in the First Amendment. While the Supreme Court would later interpret the Constitution, ensuring a separation of church and state, early Puritan settlers had a much different view of church and government. The two were inextricably linked. Discourse and discord over major social issues would also find its way into houses of worship. The Pilgrims who founded Plymouth Colony in 1620 set off from England in search of a new home. Due to their strict theology, they had irreconcilable differences with the Church of England. Despite memories of being harassed in England for their religious beliefs, the Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony were not tolerant of other forms of worship. In 1660, Mary Dyer was hanged in Boston for defying a Puritan order banning Quakers from the colony. The infamous Salem witch trials were another example of religious persecution. Laws were enacted that defined rules based on theological doctrine. As these new arrivals settled in towns like Woburn, they soon set about finding gathering places to worship. Early Protestant settlers preferred the term meeting houses for their places of worship. As immigrants from other European countries began to bring different religious philosophies to this country, the term church would become more popular. Leaders of Charlestown began looking north in search of new lands to cultivate and expand their congregation. In 1640, the General Court of Massachusetts granted them land and called it Charlestown Village. 7 commissioners were named to explore this new parcel of land. These founders of Woburn were Edward Converse, John Musil, Samuel Richardson, Thomas Richardson, Ezekiel Richardson, Thomas Graves, and their leader, Captain Edward Johnson. Their task was to lay out the town and erect a missionary house of worship. The 7 commissioners set out to explore this new territory in November 1640. Buoyed by their fervent and strict religious devotion, they bravely entered a heavy forested landscape exposed to dangers posed by warring natives. There were no roads, landmarks, or houses to provide shelter. Being winter, they became lost in a snowstorm and forced to seek shelter under rocks near the Shawsheen River. These early Woburn pioneers were strong in faith, strong in character, and strong in will. This unexplored territory was large and encompassed areas now occupied by not only Woburn, but major portions of Winchester, Wilmington, and Burlington. In 1642, by an act of the General Court, Woburn was incorporated with these words, quote, Charlestown Village is called Woburn, end quote, making it the 20th town in the Massachusetts colony. In 1642, the same year as Woburn's incorporation as a town, the first meeting house was built. The house of worship was the town, and the town was the house of worship, built on a foundation of Puritan principles. It was the 20th Congregational Church founded in Massachusetts and the 25th in America. The first burial ground was also laid out on Park Street in 1642 and was owned by the first parish. It is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Early records indicate the site of the meeting house to be at the crossroads of Hilly Way, Up Street, Saw Pit Lane, and Military Lane, original roads established by the founders. While the exact location of these roads has blurred, we know that it was built at the southerly side of what we now know as Woburn Common. It was referred to as, quote, the first temple of God in the wilderness, end quote. It was simple and practical, built of logs and containing only a few wooden benches. The first gathering was held on August 14, 1642. Reverend Thomas Carter, the first minister of the parish, was ordained on November 22, 1642. While other ministers were in attendance, the unique ceremony of the imposition of hands upon his head was performed by laymen of the parish, believed to be Edward Johnson and Edward Converse. Consistent with the Congregationalist philosophy, this action of independence was an essential part of the covenant practiced by this flock, a covenant that steadfastly remains within the Church today. Reverend Carter served the parish for 42 years. He lived to the rear of the first meeting house on Pleasant Street with his wife, Mary Dalton, and their 8 children. He died in 1684 and is buried in the first burial ground. As the only religion in town and one that enforced a strict theology, it was inevitable that dissent would occur. In the 1660s, the Baptist movement grew out of a struggle with the Puritan religion over the mandatory practice of sprinkling of water at baptism. Believing that the New Testament sanctioned baptism by immersion only, Baptist sentiment grew. The denial of the petition to worship fostered the trouble between the Church and those becoming Baptists. In Woburn, a child, Sarah Wright, was born without a breast or backbone. It was said as punishment for the parents for believing in Baptist doctrine. In 1671, the child's father, Joseph Wright, was indicted for connection with Baptist practices and prosecuted in civil court. He was both persecuted and prosecuted by the Church. It was determined, however, that this misfortune had come to worthy people, but resulting from, quote, imbibing in the principles of the Baptist sect, end quote. Mr. Wright reconciled with the First Church and eventually became a deacon. There is no record of Baptist activity in Woburn for the next 100 years. The first parish played an important role in colonial history. There existed a strong spirit of duty and honor among the members. The first call to duty came in 1676, when 58 men from the parish served as soldiers in the King Philip Indian Wars. It was a perilous time, especially for those living in the outskirts of the town. Indian raids were common, and aid was not always available. The Francis Wyman House, built in 1666 and located in what is now Burlington, was used as a garrison during these times and acted as an outpost to fend off the Indian threat. Having outgrown the initial building, the second meeting house was built in 1672 on the hill east of the Common, known then as Meeting House Hill, better known to us as Nanny Goat Hill. It had only 3 wooden benches. In this same year, Edward Johnson, the last survivor of the original founders, died. The first town clerk and a prominent military officer, he is considered the founder of Woburn. He is buried in the first burial ground. In 1675, Samuel Walker was the first man licensed to sell intoxicating liquor, opened the first of many taverns, and fined for improper sale of liquor. The issue of temperance would cause serious rifts in local houses of worship. Upon Reverend Carter's passing, Reverend Jabez Fox became minister. He had been serving as Reverend Carter's assistant since 1679, and he served until 1703. He was succeeded by his son John. The third meeting house was built in 1752 and relocated to the Common. This was the last meeting house where people of Woburn worshipped together before separating into different denominations. The ravages of smallpox killed men, women, and children, and so too did the Revolutionary War. The impact of the American Revolution had an unsettling effect on the church. No minister attended to the flock from 1775 to 1785. History records the patriotic fervor exhibited by Woburn men, including many from this parish. 15 Revolutionary War heroes, including Daniel Thompson, Woburn's first casualty of the war and member of the first parish, are buried in the first burial ground, which at the time was owned by the church. Ancestors of 3 American presidents, Pierce, Cleveland, and Harrison, are also interred in the first burial ground. The first Revolutionary War soldier and the last American soldier to die in the Vietnam conflict, Charles McMahon, were buried from this church. In 1759, another breach in the wall of dominance of the first parish occurred when the Episcopal Society held services at the old Cutler House. While not gaining a foothold in Woburn, the Episcopal Society would return. While few in number, slaves existed in Woburn during this period. Dr. Jonathan Haywood, a graduate of Harvard College and married to Ruth Burbine, died in 1749 and was buried in the first burial ground. In 1751, records indicate that Mrs. Haywood sold, quote, to Mr. Timothy Walker, a Negro boy named Prince, which I have owned for some time, end quote. A centenarian, Prince Walker lived the rest of his life in Woburn. Amos Fortune came to Woburn as a slave and gained his freedom in 1769, bought a home at Main and Intervale Street, and worked as a carpenter and tanner. Throughout the area, slaves did attend church services along with their owners, albeit relegated to the back of the church or balcony. It provided them, however, with opportunities to interact with other slaves and make friends. In 1794, the second burial ground was established by the first parish on what is now Montville Avenue. 51 Revolutionary War soldiers are buried there. When the parish appointed Reverend Joseph Chickering in 1804 as pastor, it marked a new wave of participation of women in parish life. The Ladies' Charitable Reading Society was organized in 1815. They launched a new age of awareness through reading, not only during worship, but also as a way of life. Through their efforts, a charitable religious library was established. These women organized a Sunday school for 575 scholars in 1818. After many meetings discussing whether to repair or rebuild the inadequate third meeting house, a suspicious fire resolved the matter on June 17, 1808. Despite posting a reward, the culprit was not found. The building was destroyed along with all of the early records of the church. In 1809, the fourth meeting house at the corner of Pleasant and Wynn Streets was erected. It was torn down in 1840 due to deteriorating timbers. Reverend Joseph Bennett took over in 1822. During his tenure, he continued and expanded the pastoral work initiated by his predecessor. Pastor Bennett raised funds to match the donation of Isaac Warren, who founded Warren Academy in 1827, quote, to promote the glory of God and the literary, moral, and religious instruction of youth, end quote. The second burial ground was sold to the town in 1824. The opening of the Woburn branch of the former Boston and Maine Railroad in South Woburn brought many new residents to what is now Winchester. This influx prompted current parish members who also lived there to form their own parish. The first parish accepted their request for dismissal and wished them Godspeed in their endeavor. The third colony was then established. In 1840, the fifth and much larger meeting house was built on the same site as its predecessor, on the corner of Wynn and Pleasant Streets. Reverend Bennett concluded his successful stewardship in 1847. While a series of pastors served with distinction during this period and into the 20th century, the pastorate of Reverend Daniel March will conclude the discussion of the first parish. In his tenure, a number of important events and significant social changes occurred that impacted the history of the first parish. Reverend March served his first term as pastor from 1856 to 1862, whereupon he traveled extensively in missionary work. He served again as pastor from 1876 through 1909. He served before, during, and after the Civil War. He had an enormous positive impact on the congregation. There are strong indications that the church or church members were involved in the Underground Railroad that assisted slaves escaping the South. In 1860, Reverend March saw the completion of the 6th meeting house at the corner of Main Street and Church Avenue, or as we know it today, the First Congregational Church. Dedicated on October 31st, 1860, it is an architectural marvel. Its spire reaches 196 feet to the sky. It is the largest wooden church in America, whose sanctuary is not supported by interior pillars. Simplistic in interior design, it houses a splendid and grand hook organ, installed in 1869 at the cost of $8,500. After traveling extensively in missionary work, Reverend March returned for his second term as pastor in 1876 and remained until 1909. He inspired his congregation to involve themselves in missionary work. He devoted himself to working with the children of the church. He oversaw the establishment of the 5th colony, the Montville Congregational Church, in 1892. Under his leadership, emphasis was placed on music, home missions, ministerial relief, education, and foreign missions. Scholarly as well as spiritual, Dr. March was well liked by his congregation, and his executive prowess left the church in flourishing condition. Church historian and current Woburn citizen O. James Inishima wrote in his recent history of the church the following excerpt. Quote, "Since Daniel March's pastorate, the nation has undergone an industrial revolution. With greater mobility, the demographic change was inevitable, and with it followed changes in moral and spiritual values. 2 world wars, challenges of secularism, and the rapid use of technology have left many in moral and spiritual wilderness." End quote. The use of the term wilderness is significant, since it harkens back to 1640, when the same word was used to describe the building of the first parish. The history of the First Congregational Church is a microcosm of the history of many early American churches. It began as the only church in the town, and membership increased as additional settlers arrived. A thriving church, it also spawned other churches under the Protestant banner, some with different philosophies. Later, immigrants from other European countries would bring with them their own unique religions. With declining immigration from former English strongholds, exploding immigration from other European countries with different forms of worship, and ever-increasing Protestant sects evolving, membership in the first parish would decline. As we will see, this pattern will not be unique to the Congregationalist in Woburn. In a salute to the generations of churchgoers struggling to maintain the church, this photograph dated 1877 notes the first time the church required renovations to replace falling slates due to a storm. We have become familiar with these recurring maintenance issues that seem to plague the church to this day. For hundreds of years, undaunted by its setbacks and emboldened by its commitment to faith and charity, the First Congregational Church has been a bastion of strong spiritual, civic, and social leadership in Woburn. It must also be noted that it is an important and undeniable part of our historic fabric. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1992. The first and second burial grounds were established and originally owned by the church. Many of our founding fathers, Revolutionary War heroes, and leading citizens are interred there. An important and physical link to this glorious past is represented by the large stone boulder that remains at the southeast corner of the front lawn of the church. It is a horse block, inscribed with the date of 1642. It was used to assist a woman in mounting or dismounting a horse at the first meeting house. When the 6th meeting house was built, the 5th meeting house was sold to the Unitarian Church. They uncovered it when relocating the church on the site and raising the foundation. It had been utilized as part of the foundations of the 4th and 5th meeting houses when it was no longer used as a horse block. It was moved to its current site, and the burn marks from the fire that destroyed the 3rd meeting house can still be identified. While the church retains many historic documents and treasures, 8 silver chalices deserve comment. Dating from 1726 to 1822, these communion servers were donated by members of the church. Gold and silver were luxuries of the day, and most churches were satisfied with pewter. These were men of wealth and standing in the community. Eliza Flagg, Roland Cotton, Nathaniel Saltonstall, Isaac Stone, and Joseph Lawrence were generous and faithful to Woburn and its first church. While these servers are currently at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the church may need to sell some pieces to help support the church. These relics represent Woburn's past and are the genesis of who we are as citizens of Woburn. They are a link to our great colonial history. On the 300th anniversary of the church in 1942, Miss Grace W. Hertz noted, quote, "The 300 years of the history of this first church in Woburn cannot come to a close without mention of the influence of the church beyond its own gates. By recalling this, we honor the memory of all the men and women who through calm and storm have forwarded the interests of the church we love." End quote. Amen, Miss Hertz. As early as 1846, the first parish allowed parishioners who lived 2 or 3 miles from the center of town to gather and attend services in a large room rented in the village schoolhouse located at the corner of Main and School Streets in North Woburn. Reverend Samuel Sewell, well-known author of the History of Woburn, published in 1868, served as the first pastor. He formed a Sabbath school in the same year. The North Woburn Church was formally organized on March 1st, 1849. 40 people presented letters of dismissal from other churches for the purpose of joining this proposed church. 33 were from the first church. Land was purchased and a small meeting house was built on Main Street near the Count Rumford birthplace and dedicated on October 11, 1849. In the next month, the church was officially named the North Congregational Church. By 1866, it had 59 members. The current church was built and dedicated in 1883, and the parsonage on Elm Street was built in 1894. Active in many outreach programs, the church today continues to thrive and be part of the community.
This church was founded as a neighborhood church, and it's still in many ways a neighborhood church. Most of the parishioners come from North Woburn or came from North Woburn and have moved a little farther out, although we do draw from surrounding towns also.
I was going to ask if you have people come from, other
Burlington, Wilmington.
That's wonderful. How big is your congregation?
We have 180 participants.
Now, is that every Sunday?
Oh, no, I wish they all came every Sunday. They don't.
Don't we all, huh?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
How many do you have normally on a Sunday?
Probably 60.
That's not
maybe
too bad.
70.
Yeah, considering that's not too bad, really.
No.
Considering.
Yeah.
How does the church support itself? Is it independent?
The church, yes, we're congregational, so we're descended from the Pilgrims. Our church is an independent corporation. However, we are affiliated with our denomination, which is the United Church of Christ. The United Church of Christ was formed by the merger of several denominations, actually 2 denominations that were each the result of mergers of other denominations. So it was a movement toward bringing Christians back together. You know how fragmented we are on Sunday mornings. We all go to our own little niche of churches. And this is a continuing movement to try to bring some people back together. There's The slogan, which comes straight out of the Bible, out of the Gospel of John, is that they may all be one.
How about the members that are here? Are they required to do so many service hours where you are self-sustaining? Are there programs? I know you have the 12-step program here.
We do have 12-step groups who meet here. We do lots of work for the community. And nobody's required to do it, but people step forward to do it because it's so rewarding. We have a close relationship with the food pantry. We do a perpetual collection for them. We do the holiday food baskets that they distribute. We work there on the days of the postal workers' food drives.
Oh yes, yeah.
We send a team to work
Tons
there.
of food comes in, thank goodness.
Tons
Twice
of food.
a year,
Yeah.
right? Twice a year.
Yeah.
What are the rewards of being a spiritual leader?
Well, plus it's just an extraordinary privilege to be part of everybody's life, to know what's going on, to stand up on Sunday morning and look out and just know so much about everyone, to be invited into their homes, to be present at their dying, to be present at their marrying, to be present at their baptisms. It's a huge privilege.
This tiny and beautiful church, nestled in the trees of East Woburn, has had many faces and has been a haven for those in this section of Woburn seeking religious expression. In 1867, a new religious movement began in the Montville village by William F. Mayhew, a theological student at the New Jerusalem Church in Waltham. He started holding services at the Montville schoolhouse. Then, as his popularity grew, the Porter Hose House on what is now Hawthorne Street was used. In the next year, he formed the New Jerusalem Church. Land was purchased from Abijah Thompson and Stephen Dow, and soon a small chapel was built. In 1892, the Montville Congregational Church was officially established as a colony of the First Congregational Church under the leadership of Reverend Marston, its first pastor. The church has engaged a number of spiritual and dedicated pastors since its inception, and many with interesting backgrounds, including Walcott Calkins. Upon the resignation of Reverend Jackson in 1897, the church sought the services of Reverend Calkins. Much sought after because of his spiritual, literary, and professional resume, the committee offered him the sum of $10 a week or $520 a year to assume the pastorate. Dr. Calkins accepted. A minister of great distinction, Dr. Calkins was pastor of the Montville Congregational Church from 1898 to 1907 and continued as pastor emeritus until his death in 1924. This small but caring church retains the link to its origin. Through the years, many faithful members who live in the neighborhood keep this little church strong under the leadership of Pastor Mark A. Hurd. While the rift over baptisms in 1671 did not have an immediate impact on the first parish, Baptist philosophy grew. In 1781, there were about 25 Baptist churches in Massachusetts. The Baptist Church in East Cambridge began to offer alternatives to the doctrine of the first parish. It wasn't until 1793 that the first Baptist meetings were held in private homes in Woburn. Soon, a large unfinished building was erected on the southerly side of Lowell Street in Central Square, followed in 1794 with the first meeting house built and owned by the Baptist Society. It was located at the corner of Church and Main Streets. Described as a square building without a steeple or a bell, it had 3 galleries supported by columns. It had sheep pen pews with narrow, plain board seats without cushions. In 1804, a religious revival movement surfaced, and evangelist minister Reverend Thomas Paul preached to the Baptist, despite, as recorded in records, his being, quote, belonging to the despised race of colored men, end quote. This strange and seemingly contradictory situation saw his success in bringing new parishioners to the fold, but not necessarily well received by all. In 1827, church members sought a more central and convenient location for a new church. The plans were prepared by famed architect Charles Bulfinch. In 1828, the church was completed and dedicated at the corner of Wynn and Park Streets. The shape and proportions of the church tower generated rave reviews and was soon adopted as a model by other churches. The First Baptist Church attracted many followers and soon became a house of worship with a large congregation to match the Congregationalists. Like the earlier troubles incurred by the First Congregational Church, the First Baptist Church had dissenters. Unlike the schism that marked the first parish descent, this disagreement was based on sermons delivered from the pulpit. In 1838, the pastor, Reverend Noah Hooper, delivered sermons decrying slavery and the use of alcohol. 49 members of the church bitterly opposed the subject of these topics being delivered in the church. The dissenters withdrew from the church and received their letters of dismissal within 48 hours. They formed the Independent Baptist Church, known unflatteringly at the time as the Jug Baptists. The church did not survive past the Civil War. During this period, discussion of major social issues, especially temperance and slavery, began to find their way to a number of pulpits. Not surprisingly, their appearance was met by mixed reviews. Tragedy befell the Baptist Church in 1925. A fire consumed the beautiful structure and destroyed it beyond repair. While an offer to join the First Congregational Church was made, the parishioners chose to rebuild. Perhaps the hard feelings incurred in 1828 still lingered. The church was rebuilt in stages, and in 1927 the auditorium was open for worship and the organ dedicated.
The First Baptist Church in Woburn is an American Baptist church of the United States, and that's a Protestant free church denomination here in the United States and abroad. And as an American Baptist church, we are Protestant in that folks are able to come of their own volition. We don't have a lot of mandates for them in terms of church attendance or study or anything, so that the folks that do come really want to be here. We're touchstones in the life cycle of most human beings, most individuals and families. And I find people will come when they're considering a change in their vocation or their career, or they're struggling in terms of how to manage their lives. I also find people when they have children, they sense that they want something more for their children that they themselves might not be able to provide, and the church provides for that. A teaching of right and wrong, a teaching of how to question and live with integrity, teaching respect and gentleness for other people. Children need that in this world. And the church is a place and a haven for parents to have a larger body of people help them raise their children. I'm just very appreciative of this opportunity with the Woburn Historical Society to go around to our different religious institutions here in the city. And my hat's off to the society because it's badly needed. People need to own who they are.
Absolutely.
Not only from the past, but who they are today. And
Religion's a part of it.
At the First Baptist Church in Woburn, we are proud to be a part of a community that is capturing and collecting its history for the generations to come.
Yes,
Woburn's a great place to be. People are wonderful here, and we're just happy to be a part of it.
Thank you very much. You did a great job.
Thank you.
In 1829, the Universalist Society built and opened a church opposite the Common. It offered an alternative to the strict teachings of other denominations. The Universalists believed in a God who embraced everyone and became active participants in social justice movements. They pursued a more just society and demanded dignity for all people, regardless of race, gender, color, or class. The church turned Woburn upside down. Its brand of revival preaching caused a huge backlash in the community. The services were described in early records as, quote, of a very stirring kind, in which preachers reveled and rioted in visions of fiery pits and lost souls, frightening the timid into confessions of sin of which they were not guilty, end quote. As the Universalists brought in fiery minister after fiery minister, opposition from other church members and ministers alike grew. Minister Hosea Ballou stirred his Universalist congregation with these words, quote, if you want to keep the bell a-ringing, you must keep the tongue a-thumping, end quote. After the liberal minister Reverend Otis Skinner was installed and gave his first sermon in 1829, the response from Reverend Bennett, pastor of the First Church, was immediate. The following Sunday he preached to his congregation. Quoting the Bible, he said, quote, your adversary the devil, seeking whom he may devour, walketh about, end quote. He warned his congregation that he had seen the devil upon the streets of Woburn, referring to the pastor of the Universalist Church. Reverend Skinner took it all in stride. His church was growing, but so was the animosity. In 1836, a wave of temperance agitation swept the country, and while most Protestant churches were aligned with the movement, the new minister at the Universalist Church took a different view. He contended that it was a good thing to take a drink when stomach pain arose. He wrote a pamphlet called The Bramble. In it he noted that it was not only a right, but a duty for a man to use intoxicating drinks, quoting scripture to bolster his argument. That was the last straw. Ministers refused to talk to him. Attacks from all corners poured upon him. It caused serious consternation within the church. Reverend Gregory was forced to resign. The church closed and the property was purchased by the town in 1841. The building was used as the town hall until 1885, when it was converted to a courthouse and police station. It remained in place until the current city hall was built in 1931. While the Baptists were making inroads in reducing the dominance of the Congregationalists, a third church was forming that would, according to John McElhenney in his book, Woburn a Past Observed, quote, in time challenged the Congregational and Baptist parishes in terms of membership, wealth, and political influence in the town, end quote. The Unitarian Church was on the move, and they arrived in 1847. Undaunted, a few members from the former Universalist Church reformed the church in 1847, dedicated to Unitarian principles. Unitarians actually embraced Universalist principles and held to liberal views on salvation, religious toleration, and gender equality. Growing rapidly, the Unitarians purchased the former Congregationalist church at the corner of Pleasant and Wynn Street in 1864. The Unitarian Church flourished and remained strong well into the 20th century. Early parishioners were Charles Choate and Jonathan Bowers Wynn, father of Charles Bowers Wynn. While the son is credited with a generous bequeath to build the Woburn Public Library, the father encouraged and supported smaller but important libraries in the town earlier in the century. In 1925, the church steeple was toppled by a tornado and never replaced. The church's enrollment underwent a steady decline and held its last service in 1990. The building was sold to the city and then sold to a Hindu congregation and remains to this day as the Satsang Center. The power of faith can overcome big obstacles. The history of the United Methodist Church of Woburn is replete with examples of how this small but committed congregation faced hardships and tragedies, but continued to grow and continue their mission. On January 1st, 1851, a group of Methodists gathered at the home of John Andrews for the first organizational meeting to form a Methodist parish in Woburn. 27 members became the core group that first year. For the next 10 years, they held services in various places, including members' homes and the town hall. Eventually, they leased a building to house a chapel at the site where later Lyceum Hall would be built. When they later purchased the chapel, it was moved to the corner of Man's Court and Main Street. In 1864, when the Unitarians purchased and moved to the former First Congregational Church at the corner of Wynn and Main Street, the Methodist Church purchased and renovated the former Unitarian Church at the corner of Main and Walnut Street, dedicating it on May 17, 1865. It should be noted that nearly 1/4 of the male members of the church were serving in the Civil War, leaving the church with fewer members and limited financial resources. Yet they managed to gather sufficient pledges, and one member, Thomas Warland, mortgaged his home to purchase the church. Calamity struck on the evening of March 6, 1873. The Great Fire of 1873 engulfed the church and the parsonage, and both structures were destroyed. Originating in the night building when a kerosene lamp exploded in the Strout Photographic Gallery, the fire consumed an entire city block from Walnut to Everett Street. Undaunted, the congregation rebuilt the church on the same site and dedicated the new church on April 2, 1874. The 1880s saw tremendous growth for the church, and by the end of the decade, larger quarters were needed. Land was purchased at what is now the corner of Main and Harlow Court. The cornerstone was laid for the new structure on July 14, 1890, and dedicated on February 22, 1891. To this day, the site remains the gathering place for the United Methodist Church of Woburn. The Methodist Church has not had to deal with dissidents within the flock, but hardships they did have to endure. Oftentimes, financial struggles tested them, and for a while they were an itinerant congregation. Led by strong and spiritual ministers, they persevered. The members hold true to their mission of worshiping God, welcoming all who seek something better, and maintaining the tradition of serving the community. Under the leadership of the pastor, Reverend Sharon Jones, the church provides space to assist other congregations, maintains a soup kitchen, and conducts English classes for those arrivals trying to assimilate to their new country. In the 1850s, the Industrial Revolution had come to America, and with it a major influx of immigrants. They came to Woburn for jobs on the farms, in the tanneries, and for the new industries emerging. Woburn was booming. As Woburn grew in population and new immigrants from different parts of Europe began to arrive from Italy, Greece, Germany, and Scandinavia, to name a few, a more diverse citizenry eventually brought different forms of worship to the town. When industry, especially tanneries, started to thrive, new immigrants surfaced with new religions that slowly but surely would end the Protestant dynasty. The Irish, with their Roman Catholic faith, arrived in the first wave. Interestingly, the first Irish citizen of Woburn appears to be Daniel McGuinness, who records show lived in the town in 1674. He married Rose Neal in 1676, and his child Rose was born in 1677, the first Irish-American born in Woburn. Like many of his countrymen, he was not welcome everywhere. On April 4, 1684, it was reported that he was removed from an estate in Medford for, quote, having a poor place and considerable family of children, and they disapprove of him as an inhabitant, end quote.
What do you think when the Catholics came here they faced, being the first?
Well, the Catholic population of eastern Massachusetts originally was French. The Catholic Church in Boston and eastern Massachusetts is basically a French church. and that was true predominantly through the early years of the American government up until the time of the large-scale immigrations from Ireland in the 1830s and 1840s. As you know, in colonial times, Catholic worship was not permitted. Indeed, it was only with the ratification of the Constitution that public Catholic worship was permitted. It was forbidden under the Massachusetts Constitution. That was in
because they had the
then.
state church. They had the state church, at that time.
Well, it was not exactly like you think of it in England. It was just that this, Catholics were certain groups like Quakers, Catholics, and so forth were specifically prohibited from public life in the colony. The early Catholics who were here tended to be French, and they were here for various reasons. The picture changed very rapidly because of the large-scale immigration in the 1830s and 1840s largely from Ireland. Other parts of the country, people came in that time frame, for instance, from Germany. New York City, the first big Catholic immigration was German, not Irish. But here, it in fact was Irish. Typically, in a place like Woburn, the Catholic people would express a desire to have Mass and other services, religious education for the children. The church would attempt to respond to that.
The introduction of the Roman Catholic faith to Woburn life began in the mid-1800s. At the time, the few Roman Catholics residing in Woburn were forced to make the long journey to the new Catholic Church built in East Cambridge. As the number of Catholic families increased, Father Strain and his successors from that church would make periodic trips to this far outpost of the parish. In 1843, the first Mass was conducted in a large home near the railroad watering station at Walnut Hill. In 1846, the town hall was used for religious services. By 1853, the Catholic population was rapidly increasing, fueled by the influx of Irish immigrants. Prior to a church being built, it was necessary to find local burial spots for the deceased Irish, who were prohibited from being buried in Woburn cemeteries. Local Irishmen bought and cleared land in East Woburn and gave it to the Archdiocese of Boston. The Calvary Cemetery was consecrated, and Irish, especially Irish Civil War veterans, were the first and largest wave of deceased to be buried there. While Woburn's first Roman Catholic Church did not experience the same type of internal conflict over doctrine or philosophy as other Woburn churches, it did have an element of discord regarding its ownership. In an open letter to the Catholics of Woburn, published in the Woburn Journal on August 13, 1853, the writer called upon his fellow Irish countrymen to reject the current proposal to build a church. It is an interesting and provocative point of view, and an excerpt follows. Quote, "I believe I express the opinion of hundreds of my fellow countrymen, even in this small town, who will never allow themselves to be trampled on by any individual, no matter what position he occupies. It is the intention of some of the Catholics of Woburn, together with a certain priest, to buy a piece of land and erect thereon a church, at the expense of the people, that after said church is finished, it is to be given unto the hands of our good and pious bishop as church property. The church in a few years will pay for itself, but if, on the other hand, you allow the priest to control the matter, you will always have trouble. You will be called on month after month and year after year for subscriptions to pay the debt of the church. I would call on you in the name of justice and in the name of the religion you profess to do all in your power to remedy the evil. You have been tyrannized and trampled on by the tyranny and unjust laws, and persecuted by a tyrannical government. You have been forced to flee from your native country and seek in this mighty republic the rights which were denied you in the land of your birth, and for which your country is still in chains and her sons in exile. You, I say, have suffered all these privations. Will you allow yourselves, after being freed from the yoke of bondage, to be trampled on by any class of people? I believe you will not allow such a state of things to exist. For my part, I shall do all in my power to prevent it, and call on all concerned to do the same. The letter was signed, An Independent Catholic. The voice of dissension fell on deaf ears, and the church was built, and the congregation grew rapidly. It soon became clear that Woburn required full-time pastoral attention. In 1862, Father McCarthy became the parochial resident and served for 2 years. In January 1864, the parish had its first pastor, with the appointment of Father John Quayle. His task was daunting. His parish encompassed the towns of Woburn, Winchester, and Burlington. The church was already too small, and Catholic immigrants were arriving in droves. Launching an immediate fundraising campaign, Father Quayle set about building a new and larger church. In September 1869, the new church was consecrated as St. Charles Borromeo Church. 2 years earlier, a rectory had been built at the corner of Main and Summer Streets. Prior to the building of the new church, Sunday Mass attendance averaged 800. As the congregation increased, additional priests were joining Father Quayle and assisting him in the work of the church. In 1884, a neighboring building was acquired and refitted with classrooms. St. John's School was born. To teach these children, the Sisters of Notre Dame were brought to Woburn and were housed in a convent on Summer Street. St. John's School would evolve into St. Charles Parochial School when the new building was built. On July 5, 1897, Father Quayle died, leaving a rich legacy. His dedication created a church that would grow and prosper.
The other topic that I really wanted to cover was what the Sisters of Notre Dame, when they came here.
Yeah. Many of those communities, the largest, practically all of those Catholic communities of the second half of the 19th century had a desire to have a Catholic school. It was an institution, an act of genius. It was the driving force for the development of the Catholic Church in this country in most of the areas that we're familiar with. Certainly everything east of the Mississippi River developed in that way. The church grew in the 19th century and through the 20th century, largely through the grace of God and the efforts of the sisters.
A series of energetic, dedicated, and forward-thinking pastors would continue to fill the spiritual and educational needs of the growing Catholic population. The church was renovated. A convent was built to house the nuns. A parish center was built in 1921. As the church population grew, the programs, services, and activities grew. Former students went on to become priests and nuns, some coming back to serve the parish. Programs and societies were formed to enhance the religious experience, including the Ladies' Sodality, the Knights of Columbus, and the Catholic Daughters of America. The Catholic Youth Organization organized children and young adults in religious, social, and sporting activities. St. Charles School expanded to include a high school for girls. As the student population expanded, more nuns came to Woburn to teach. The convent on Summer Street became home to a growing population of Notre Dame sisters. Grand and momentous processions preceded the receiving of sacraments by the children of the parish. May processions, First Communion and Confirmation brought families together. the church became the center for a large and growing segment of the community. Even a devastating fire in the upper church on Christmas Day 1951 that caused extensive damage could not curtail the spirits of this growing church. St. Charles was visited on many religious occasions by the Archbishop, then Cardinal Richard Cushing, who saw the benefits of a parochial education and oversaw the opening of elementary and high schools dedicated to educating Catholic youth of the diocese. To address the growing needs of the growing Spanish-speaking population, the Church conducts Masses in Spanish that has continued for over 40 years. St. Charles Church continued to grow and prosper throughout the century. It remains the most attended church in the city. With the opening of St. Charles, Mass was available to the few Catholics living in East Woburn. In 1870, you walked to church from there, or you rode on Pop Rice's barge that ran hourly from Stoneham to Woburn. In 1875, the recently consecrated St. Mary's Church in Winchester annexed East Woburn, and Pastor Father O'Connor celebrated Mass in the Porter Hose House for these residents. Determined to find a permanent home for East Woburn Catholics, Father O'Connor persevered until a church was erected. The first Mass in St. Joseph's Church was celebrated on the first Sunday of March in 1877. It remained a mission church of St. Mary's until 1906. Father O'Connor was succeeded by Fathers Daly, O'Brien, and Madden. It was during Father Madden's pastorate that a disastrous fire nearly destroyed the church in 1905. In the early cold morning of January 29, 1905, fire surged through the walls of the church, initiated by a boiler malfunction. While the fire was contained to the rear of the church, it moved rapidly to the roof, a major portion of which collapsed. While the edifice was saved, serious water damage was apparent throughout the building, wrecking the altar, damaging the organ, and ruining vestments and furnishings. Renovations were immediately initiated. During the reconstruction of the church, Mayor Lawrence Reed provided the Porter Hose House once again to conduct services. After renovations, the church community never lost a beat. Families gathered together at Mass. First communions and confirmations were happy and joyous occasions that brought extended families to these religious celebrations. The church became a gathering place for the Catholics of East Woburn. Religious instruction was provided by nuns, and religious and social organizations flourished in the church. Men formed a Holy Name Society. Gathered here in the spring of 1941, following a communion breakfast, most of them very soon would go off to war. Social and sporting events involving members of all ages would bring a bond of fellowship to the community. The parish community would come together to construct a shrine to the Virgin Mary. It epitomized the dedication and loyalty of the congregation. The statue now stands prominently in Calvary Cemetery. Father Madden was followed by Father Kelleher and Reverend Patrick Higgins, who was the first resident pastor in 1906, when St. Joseph's was no longer a mission church. 13 priests have served St. Joseph's Church as pastors over its history, concluding with Father Harold LeBlanc, who had the unfortunate task of closing the church in 1990. Just as the wave of Irish immigrants came to Woburn, seeking jobs and seeking a house of worship, so too did the wave of Italian immigrants, who settled in what became known as the Italian colony in North Woburn. While tanneries and farms provided employment, the Merrimack Chemical Company became the predominant employer in this section of the city. Originally established as a mission church of St. Charles in 1908, a building was purchased on Minot Street to serve as a mission chapel, allowing Catholic residents of the area to attend Sunday Mass. The first Mass was celebrated on June 13, 1909, the Feast of St. Anthony. By 1919, parish boundaries in the area were redrawn, and the mission church came under the authority of a new parish in Wilmington, St. Thomas Church. It was Reverend Richard Boland, pastor of St. Thomas's, who recognized and encouraged the devotion to honor St. Anthony shown by his new parishioners, many of whom were Italian immigrants who brought with them to America rich culture and traditions. When the Catholic population outgrew its mission chapel, Father Boland oversaw the construction of St. Anthony of Padua Church. Dedicated and blessed on April 7, 1928, the first Mass was celebrated on the next day, Easter Sunday, by Father Boland. Following the pattern of other Catholic churches, St. Anthony's grew by leaps and bounds. The church became the center of the Catholic community in North Woburn. The conferring of sacraments brought families together. Religious and social organizations flourished, and attendance at services increased. St. Anthony's became a separate parish on November 15, 1945. One event, however, separates this church from the others: the St. Anthony Festival. Harkening back to its origin, this festival honors the patron saint of the parish, St. Anthony of Padua. It involves the entire parish and invites all to join the celebration. The tradition includes spiritual as well as social components. It begins with a solemn procession and ends with fireworks, and in between a community celebrates with food, music, and carnival rides. The church continues to serve its parishioners in North Woburn, and strong community spirit remains intact. Father Richard Samarick is the current pastor of the church. The Immaculate Conception Church was established to serve the large Catholic population of southern Woburn and northern Winchester. Father James T. Fitzsimmons was appointed pastor on September 21, 1931. His task was daunting. The first Mass was celebrated in the small wooden church on January 24, 1932. Since the congregation was growing, this church was only a temporary solution. More land was procured in 1935 on Sheridan Circle, and plans for a rectory and permanent church were undertaken. In December 1936, the rectory was completed. Father Herbert Driscoll finalized the plans for construction of a new church and school, hosted Archbishop Cushing at the dedication on September 10, 1955, and converted the former church to a parish hall. When discussing the activities of the Immaculate Conception Parish, one colorful, exciting, and stirring memory emerges: the Queensman Drum and Bugle Corps and Queen's Cadets. This popular youth activity flourished and won many awards and trophies. On November 6, 2004, the final Mass was celebrated at the Immaculate Conception Church. The parish history provides the final sentence to this story. Quote, Immaculate Conception Parish was officially closed, but the light within the parishioners will continue to burn brightly wherever we go, as we remember our beloved home at Immaculate Conception Parish. End quote. After World War II, families seeking suburban living began an exodus to the west side of Woburn. Former farmlands were developed into housing units, and people flocked to the area. Soon the Catholic population was large enough to support a new church. The parish began with the appointment of Father Earl Lyons as pastor on June 7, 1954. The first Mass was celebrated in the Parker School in the summer of 1954. The response was overwhelming. The overflow crowd spilled onto the lawn. In the fall, a larger space was required, and the Legion Hall was utilized. A new church was required. Land was purchased for a permanent home, and construction began on the Cambridge Road site in 1955. St. Barbara's Church was dedicated by Cardinal Cushing on December 15, 1957. At the time, the church serviced 1,500 families in parts of Woburn, Lexington, and Burlington. The congregation grew rapidly, and participation in church activities followed. The Ladies' Sodality, Holy Name Society, Women's Club, Boy and Girl Scouts, CYO quickly bloomed. This was and is a family parish, exhibiting spirit and goodwill. The parish community involves all ages in the spiritual and social life of the church. Anxious to involve children and seniors alike, musical reviews, fashion shows, parish dinners, and senior socials create a positive and all-inclusive atmosphere. Father Charles Anador, who served the parish from 1975 to 1989, was a World War II veteran and is listed on Woburn's War Memorial. Currently, Father Vincent Malone serves as pastor. After the American Revolution, the Episcopal Church came into existence as an independent denomination as the American branch of the Anglican Union. One of the many autonomous churches bound together by tradition, scripture, and allegiance to the Archbishop of Canterbury, it derives its beginning to the English Reformation of the 16th century. Still maintaining some liturgy and customs of Catholicism, it continues to reject the authority of the papacy dating back to the actions of King Henry VIII. The Church has ordained women priests and in 1989 consecrated the first woman bishop. Interest in Episcopal philosophy was found in Woburn in the mid-1800s. On April 22, 1867, the parish was organized as a religious society and named Trinity Church. Having completed the construction of a new building at the corner of Main Street and Harlow Court in 1869, services began. From its opening in 1869 to 1887, services were held by supply rectors, and financial issues put the church's survival in question. Finally, the church officially closed in 1887. Through the perseverance of a few members, the church land was sold in 1891. After a tract of land was bought near the rear of the Methodist Church, the church itself was moved there and repaired. Services began anew under the stewardship of Reverend John W. Suter. The church was re-energized. The Trinity Church continues today as a thriving community church, welcoming all. Not only caring for the pastoral needs of the community, the church provides a daycare facility, thrift store, and focuses on helping the needy. This small but caring church burst into the national spotlight in 1979. The city of Woburn was caught in the midst of a major health, political, and social crisis. Complaints by a local mother, Ann Anderson, who had lost her son to cancer, went unheeded. Certain that well water was responsible, she sought the aid of Reverend Bruce Young, pastor of the Trinity Church. He had compassion for her suffering, but he was also aware of the reports that disputed that theory. While not convinced, he agreed to hold a meeting at the church of families affected by leukemia and other cancers. Reverend Young's leadership in determining the truth led to confirming the mother's instincts. While it is not our point to resurrect the details of this tragedy, it does highlight one of the many roles that a church continues to play in our society and remains part of Woburn history. The church has been led by Reverend John Kahn for the last 11 years. While the Irish Catholics were the first immigrants to have a great impact on the religious landscape, other immigrants from other countries added to this dynamic. Woburn would forever be a multi-religion town. One group of early settlers did not have easy opportunities to form churches. They had no rights. They had been slaves. While the African American church movement developed as early as the 1700s, mostly in the North by free slaves, few churches were organized. After the Civil War, however, greater options were available. In 1886, 11 people gathered at the residence of Currier Saunders Sims on Everett Street in Woburn to discuss the formation of a church. It was named St. Paul's Baptist Mission. Most of the attendees were parishioners of St. Paul's Church of Boston. Eventually, the name was changed to St. John's Baptist Mission, and membership increased steadily. It was decided to worship in the old fraternity hall on Main Street near High Street. Finally, on July 5, 1887, St. John's Baptist Church was fully organized with a membership of 20, growing quickly to 50. In 1888, Reverend G. G. Robinson became the first pastor of St. John's Church. Brothers Alexander Easley, Henry Dickinson, Saunders Sims, and Wilson Fitchett were committee members. After several site considerations, a church was built on Everett Street, where it stands today. The Congregation of St. John's is a benevolent body. Besides its fervent religious dedication, the church participates in many outreach projects, provides educational support, and continues to bridge the racial gap existing in the country. While discussing the church's history, one cannot ignore the social and political history made by its members and pastors. Many pastors have served the church with distinction, but some have stepped into the national spotlight. Reverend William Henry Scott was born a slave in 1848, toiled on a plantation in Virginia, and escaped in 1862 and rescued by Union soldiers. Sergeant Loring W. Muzzy of Lexington, Massachusetts, part of the Union forces, took in the young man and made him his aide-de-camp. He cared for him, mentored him, and brought him back home at the end of the war. Muzzy and his mother fostered in him a yearning for education and encouraged interest in the Baptist religion. Scott followed that path. He was ordained in 1880, and after returning to the South to teach and minister, he served as St. John's pastor from 1900 to 1906. He was among the founders of the Niagara Movement, the precursor of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He dedicated much of his life as a champion for human rights and justice for all. Reverend Harold G. Ross, Jr. served the church during the tumultuous years of racial strife in Boston. He was a direct descendant of Harriet Tubman, the heroine of the Underground Railroad movement. Reverend Ross fought the redlining practices of banks by refusing to lend money to African Americans to buy homes in certain neighborhoods of Boston. He built lines of communication across racial and ethnic lines. Clifton Reed, a current member of the church, is an honorary Tuskegee Airman. Women have played a strong role in developing a strong and vibrant church. A majority of the 13 charter members of the church, including Cora Hagee Russell, were women. Women of the church established fundraising, social, and liturgical events at the church. Many women of the church were also leaders in the Woburn community, such as Catherine Canada. Mother Canada was born in 1896, baptized in 1909, and remained an active member of the church until her death in 1991. A strong and supportive church, St. John's remains a stalwart member of the Woburn church community. Woburn was discovered by the Scandinavians in 1881 when the Bryant and King tannery moved to Woburn. Included in its employees who followed were 25 Scandinavians. This brought a new migration wave to Woburn from mostly Sweden, but also Denmark and to a lesser degree Norway. Since most of the arrivals were from Sweden, they brought with them their Lutheran faith, the State Church of Sweden. In coming to America, however, some wished to express their right to religious freedom and look elsewhere. Eventually, those who wished to remain in the Lutheran Church founded a church on Montville Avenue. Others formed the Scandinavian Evangelical Free Church and built their house of worship also on Montville Avenue within yards of the other church. While meetings of interested citizens longing to form a church had occurred earlier, a meeting called on June 2, 1884, that continued to June 3rd and completed on June 6th, is considered as the dates of origin of the Scandinavian Evangelical Free Church of Woburn. The original 7 enrolled members on the first day consisted of 3 women and 4 men, and increased to 15 by day 3. Most of the interested did not wish to remain adherents to the Lutheran state church. Many early immigrants turned against the Lutheran Church in Sweden because of a tax placed on church members and a feeling that it was a church of nobility and lacked respect for the poor. Also, this new society wanted to admit into membership anyone of moral character and held the view that the Church of Christ can only have members who profess Christ as their personal Savior, who have the experience of a new birth. When they came to America, they had the freedom to follow their religious wishes and made changes. The Swedish community had a great deal in common in the early days, but the differences in their religious practices led eventually to a parting of the ways and the formation of this new church. Led by the strong and influential leader of the Swedish community, Charles Rosenquist, the group sought out a pastor to come each Sunday to preach the gospel. This was no easy task, since there were very few Swedish ministers in the country at the time, and especially one who preached in the Swedish language. Instead, O.G. Tingloff, a recent immigrant from Sweden who had later studied for the ministry, answered the call, but refused to accept a fixed salary. Only what the church periodically offered would be acceptable. On August 3, 1884, the church celebrated communion for the first time in the first Congregational church, space offered to them in goodwill. In 1887, the ladies formed the Sewing Society, which was a very important part of the church. These ladies auctioned their goods to raise money for the church's mission. There were a few pastors and an elderly lay preacher who faithfully served the congregation. There was no ordained minister until 1889, when Reverend Mr. Allberg arrived. At this time, members determined that a church was necessary. Land was acquired and the cornerstone was laid on October 11, 1890, on the site at the corner of Montville Avenue and Greenwood Avenue. In 1896, church bells were acquired by a gift from the Warren Academy. In 1915, a parsonage was set up at 59 Eastern Avenue. The church flourished and was fortunate to find a succession of good pastors. In 1936, however, there came a dilemma. Needing to find a pastor, it was difficult to secure someone fluent in Swedish. Not only did they find such a man, but they found a man with a vision. Reverend Carlton Helgeson from Rhode Island, and a son of Swedish immigrants, built his pastorate on a straightforward Bible teaching. But Reverend Helgeson knew that changes were occurring within the flock that needed to be addressed. Children born to members of the church were marrying men and women from other than Scandinavian backgrounds. The ethnic character of the church was slowly changing. During his tenure, services began to be conducted in English on a limited basis, and eventually in 1950, the church was renamed the Church of the Open Bible. The church's membership grew rapidly after World War II, and larger quarters were necessary. A gift of 3.4 acres of land in Burlington was given by Mrs. Agda J. Thistle. The building of a new church began and was dedicated in 1961 at the corner of Wynn and Wyman Streets.
As you travel along on the Jericho Road, does your world seem all wrong? And heavy will bless.
Your heart he will bless.
On the Jericho road.
On the Jericho road,
There's room for just two.
there's room for just two, no more and no less.
No more and no less. Just Jesus and you.
Just Jesus and you, each burden he'll bear.
Each burden he'll bear.
Each sorrow he'll share.
Each sorrow he'll share.
There's never a care.
There's never a care, for Jesus is there.
For Jesus is there.
Today, this church is led by Senior Pastor William L. Krochek, who was called to serve in 2004. The church is thriving and continues to hold the strong belief and service that were held by the generations before them. The Lutheran Church Society was formed in 1893. Its beginning mirrors the beginning of the Scandinavian Evangelical Free Church. Established by a small, tightly knit community of Swedish immigrants, they intended to conduct their services in Swedish. But there was one big difference. This church would follow the Articles of Faith of the Lutheran Church. In September of 1893, Pastor Henning Jacobson of Boston was the first Lutheran pastor to preach the gospel in Woburn. A series of students pastored the congregation until Pastor O.A. Henry became the first permanent pastor in 1898. He would be succeeded by Pastor Crone, a former student pastor. In 1895, the church bought land, and a church was built in 1897 on Montville Avenue, next to the First Armory in Woburn, currently the site of the Anchor Baptist Church. Confirmation services brought the congregation together as a community, and the first person confirmed was Jenny E. Pearson in 1896. Later in those early years, larger groups were confirmed. The church membership grew, and the Sunday School for Children was added, a young people's society was organized, and a pipe organ was purchased. In 1930, conducting services in Swedish was discontinued. The church school was an integral part of church life. Ruth Franson Haggerty, class of 1934, Kenneth Johnson and Edna Blackman Redfern, class of 1939, and Elsie Gustafson, class of 1943, are pictured here. The Ladies' Auxiliary provides much needed support to the church's mission. Children do their part as members of the Junior Missionary Society. Pastor J. Herman Olson guided the church through most of the years of World War II. The church was attracting new parishioners from different cities and towns, with various ethnic backgrounds and occupations. As the congregation grew, a new church was needed. Land was finally procured from the city at Forest Park. A stunning turnout for church services was held outdoors on the recently purchased land in 1961. A parsonage was completed in 1962. In 1970, the renamed Lutheran Church of the Redeemer dedicated its new church on Forest Park Road. In 1994, the church celebrated its 100th anniversary. With new quarters and a larger congregation, additional outreach programs followed. In 1997, the church founded Little Hands, Big Hearts Christian Preschool, consistent with the church's mission to minister in many ways, including education. Director Mary Ann Onesimo has led the program for the past 16 years. While no longer a strictly Swedish congregation, the church remains a tight-knit and welcoming community, led by Pastor Reverend Dr. William Bogholtz. The story of Woburn's Hebrew temple is one that mirrors the saga of all small but committed congregations. At the turn of the 20th century, some Woburn residents of the Jewish faith longed to form their own temple. Gathering additional members from surrounding communities, a committed group led by Pearl Brown of Woburn founded the Woburn Hebrew Center. The congregation assembled for the first time in her home in 1906. During the early years, services were held in rented spaces in Woburn, including the halls above Gavin's Market and Fireside Gift Shop, Mechanics Hall, and the Moose Hall on Campbell Street. After the Yom Kippur service was disrupted at the Moose Hall because tables had to be set up for a whist party, the decision was made to purchase a building. Morris Kaplan, the owner of a tannery on Green Street, was closing his business and agreed to sell the group a building used for offices and a garage. The Woburn Hebrew Center bought the property and vacant adjacent property that previously housed a fire station. It was donated by the city, providing sufficient land to provide for a temple. In 1930, the building at 14 Green Street was dedicated. Taking the name Temple Emeth Shalom, Meyer S. Baer became rabbi and served for many years. In 1946, the Hebrew Center Cemetery was established in East Woburn. When some alienated members left the temple in the late 1950s, there were not enough members remaining to continue, and the temple closed. It tried twice in early 1960 to reopen, only to close both times. In one last effort, Melvin Lieberman was approached and asked by 2 trustees to become president and reopen the temple. He agreed, but only if the temple affiliate with the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. They agreed. Mr. Lieberman reopened the temple, initiated the affiliation, and changed the name of the temple to Temple Shalom Emeth at the request of the new organization, effectively putting peace before truth. When the temple continued to struggle, assistance was provided by the organization. The only solution was amalgamation. After merging with the Shawsheen Valley Jewish Community Center in 1973, Temple Shalom Emeth bought property on Lexington Street in Burlington, built a new facility, and remains today as a thriving Jewish community. The bar mitzvah of Stephen Lieberman on December 4th, 1971, was the last service held at the temple in Woburn. While the Woburn Hebrew Center no longer exists in Woburn, one Woburn citizen deserves mention. Mr. Mel Lieberman played an important role in the development and success of this temple. He was not only devout to his faith, but he was also devoted to Woburn history. As a longtime board of director and program chairman of the Burbank Lecture Series, he committed himself to maintaining the goal of Leonard Thompson of bringing free public lectures to the Woburn community. His memory endures.
We had families here, and whether it be the Verises or the Varutzoses or the Barbases or whomever you wanted to pick out of the community, there were not that many families in the beginning in this community, and this community struggled.
Greek immigrants were the last wave of Europeans to come to the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. But unlike other nationalities, they did so in small numbers. The men came first, found jobs, assimilated into the culture, brought their families, and became citizens. Drawn to the tanneries, they accepted the low-paying wages of the remaining jobs. Determined to accept the challenge and show character in the face of diversity, they worked hard, learned a new language, and developed a positive reputation in the community, at the same time maintaining their rich tradition and culture. In September 1917, at the first parish council meeting, Father Georgios Constantou was voted to be the regular priest of the Greek Orthodox community, known as the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary. In September of 1917, members of the Greek community purchased a home on Harlow Court to the rear of the Methodist Church for religious purposes and a school. In 1918, a larger house, the Thomas More Estate, at the intersection of Montville Avenue and Union Street was bought. The Greek community immersed themselves into the social and civic life of Woburn. They participated in parades honoring returning veterans, conducted picnics at the Pernocas farm, celebrated Greek holidays with public events, and organized theatrical performances. With the approval of church authorities, a new building was planned. In elaborate ceremonies on November 18, 1957, the laying of the cornerstone was dedicated by Archbishop Makarios, Greek Orthodox Bishop of the island of Cyprus and former pastor of the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary Church. Once again, a member of Woburn's religious community had stepped onto the world stage. Archbishop Makarios was not only the official head of the Orthodox Church in Cyprus, but first president of the Republic in 1960 until 1974. Because of his actions in urging the freedom of Cyprus from British rule, he was banished to the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean. These actions prompted the United Nations to react. When he was released from exile, Aristotle Onassis dispatched one of his luxury liners to the Indian Ocean so the bishop would have a regal homecoming. The church was and is the center of the Greek community. The beautifully carved bishop's throne, which adorns the church today, was a personal gift from Archbishop Makarios.
Here I am now, by the grace of God and by the assignment of His Eminence, Metropolitan Methodius, I've come in a sense full circle to come back to this parish and to serve a parish, of course, whose patron saint is the Blessed Virgin Mary, who's of course my own patron saint. In Greek, of course, my name being Panayotis. So it's a source of really great satisfaction. With the grace of God, I look forward to even greater things in the future, because I think this parish now is a kind on a spiritual roll. And with God's grace, we're going to continue and make the most of this wonderful building that has come up.
Time did not permit either explaining the different factions that have evolved in many of the church organizations, or discussing the new churches that have come to Woburn in the 20th or 21st centuries. It is clear, however, that when a need arises, Woburn welcomes new churches and new ideas. The early settlers looking ahead to the current day would be shocked at the number and diversity of the houses of worship, saddened by the secular society and the dwindling church memberships, but emboldened by the strength and commitment of the volunteers to the mission of Woburn churches. There is no doubt that each and every church has had a role in defining who we are as citizens. In keeping with America's call of freedom, religious expression is alive and well in Woburn. A number of clergy assisting in this presentation bemoaned the decline of family church attendance. They pointed to competition from children's sports and activities, the repeal of the Blue Laws, and the lack of respect for the solemnity of Sunday. While these issues are relevant, a house of worship can be made stronger only if parents make a commitment to their church and establish attendance as a priority. The children will follow.